Introduce you back here in Washington, D.C. to our final guest on the Washington Journal on this Thursday morning, Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio. He's a Republican and he's a member of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, which will today be hearing from former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson. Congressman, good morning, first of all.
Morning, Susan.
The testimony was sent out in advance by Mr. Paulson to sort of set the stage for his appearance today, and I want to show you two headlines and get your reaction to them. First of all, in the Washington Times, Paulson takes blame for B of A Merrill deal. And then another one in USA Today, Paulson, U.S. was saved from great peril.
Well, I mean, the argument you hear from everyone who's been pro-stimulus, pro-bailout, taking us down this road that I think is wrong and I voted against has always been, it would have been worse had we not stepped in and put all this taxpayer money at risk. And so certainly Mr. Paulson is going to adhere to that argument. I think what's interesting also in Mr. Paulson's testimony, if you read it, he basically admits to intimidating and threatening Ken Lewis. We had Ken Lewis a few weeks ago in front of the committee, and it was to sit there and watch Ken Lewis, you actually felt for the guy a little bit because he had to walk this tightrope where he said he sort of had to admit that he was threatened, and he did. And I think everyone in the committee room understood that. But he also had to kind of not say it specifically because these folks still exercise a great deal of influence as far as the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department. And Tim Geithner was involved in this last fall as well. So that's what I think is interesting about my concern, and the questions I'll ask Mr. Paulson are what I believe is intimidation. Everyone understands it. I mean, we see that took place with Ken Lewis. But my bigger concern is this pattern of deception. And it goes right back to the start, and I brought this up with both Mr. Lewis and Mr. Bernanke when they were in front of the committee. Go back to the October 13th meeting where the 9 biggest bank CEOs were invited to Washington, not invited, told to come to Washington. According to Ken Lewis's testimony, they didn't know what the meeting was going to be about. They thought it was going to be talking about the general economic concerns. At the meeting, the 9 banks were on one side of the table. Mr. Geithner, Mr. Bernanke, Mr. Paulson, and Sheila Bair were on the other side. 45-minute meeting. I think about this 45-minute meeting. They come there. They don't know what it's about. They're slid a piece of paper across the table. They're asked to sign the paper and write in the amount of TARP money they're going to take. I mean, so right from the start, we had this. Banks didn't know what the meeting was about, and then this deception continues with failure to timely disclose what was happening at Merrill, timing when those disclosures take place. We've got emails that point that out, and that'll be brought out in today's committee hearings as well. So that's my concern, because when you think about it, the unprecedented level of involvement of the government in the private sector now, this is what's scary. When you have this kind of pressure, this kind of intimidation, this kind of potential, I think, pattern of deception is a real concern when we think now about what we see with the auto task force, what we may potentially see with the takeover of health care by the federal government as well. That's my big concern.
You referenced it, but last month the committee heard from the Fed chief, Ben Bernanke. We have just a short clip. I want to talk to you after we watch it about really what the goal with this whole series of conversations of witnesses. Let's listen in.
Chairman Bernanke, did you instruct Hank Paulson to tell Ken Lewis that he and his board would be fired if they backed out of the Merrill deal?
I did not.
Well, I understand that Mr. Paulson told Mr. Cuomo that you did. I just want to share that with you.
I did not instruct Mr. Paulson or anyone else to convey such a threat or message to Mr. Lewis.
Did you personally tell Mr. Lewis that you would fire him or remove the Bank of America board if Mr. Lewis backed out of the Merrill Lynch deal?
I did not.
Ken Lewis testified under oath here and also told his board of directors that you and Mr. Paulson made verbal commitments to him in December of 2008 to provide Bank of America with enough money to fill the hole created by the $12 billion loss at Merrill Lynch. In December of 2008, did you promise Mr. Lewis that you would provide Bank of America with enough capital to fill the $12 billion hole created by the losses at Merrill Lynch?
I did not promise any specific amount of money. What was committed was the commitment of the government to work in good faith with Bank of America to develop a contingency plan that would assure the viability of the company in case of a financial crisis.
What is the point? What exactly is the committee trying to get at here?
Well, if you notice, Mr. Bernanke said, I did not tell Mr. Paulson to convey that message. Now, the fact that we've got emails that suggest they talked about it, that they believe that this deal should go forward, and that Mr. Paulson admits in his testimony that he did in fact tell Mr. Lewis, you need to go forward with this deal or you and your board are in trouble. So sometimes I think sharp people are pretty good at saying it the right way when they're in front of a committee in Congress. The point is, as I said earlier, there was definitely intimidation taking place. All I had to do was listen to Ken Lewis's testimony and how he handled the questions that were put to him when he was in front of the committee a few weeks ago. And as I pointed out, the bigger concern is this kind of unprecedented influence we've seen in this Bank of America Merrill Lynch deal, how it may have implications for other areas where we now see unprecedented federal involvement. We heard last week that Fritz Henderson says, when you think about the auto task force, he's on a short leash when it comes to running General Motors because the task force is there meeting with him on a daily basis. So this is what's scary, and as I've said many times, if in fact we have what the Democrats are now proposing when it comes to a federal takeover of health care, and we have this comparative effectiveness board, this I think highlights the kind of treatment we can expect, the kind of actions we can expect if in fact we move down the road as someone to travel.
Specifically in this committee, what are the partisan differences in the approach to questioning?
I mean, frankly, the Democrats want to say that Ken Lewis was trying to secure additional taxpayer dollars, additional TARP dollars, and that's why he went to Mr. Paulson and Mr. Bernanke and said, look, I'm thinking about exercising the MAC clause and getting out of the deal as a way to leverage additional dollars. I happen to think it was just the opposite based on the facts, and that it was the government putting pressure on Mr. Lewis to go through with the deal. I mean, think about it. Mr. Lewis expressed reservations because Merrill had $12 billion in losses. That's I think doing your fiduciary responsibility, doing your job to your company and to your shareholders. That's why he expressed those reservations. And so I come at it from that angle, and frankly from the angle that this is, as I've said before, unprecedented involvement by the government in the private sector.
C-SPAN cameras will be at the committee today in the Rayburn House office building because of the busy schedule on the floors and also the confirmation hearings. It's available live on cspan.org, and there will be opportunities both to watch it on the internet and on our television channels as the day progresses. The formal title of the hearing today is Bank of America and Merrill Lynch, How Did a Private Deal Turn into a Federal Bailout? We'd like to hear from you, your questions, beginning with Ridgeway, Pennsylvania. This is Thomas on our Democrats line. You're on for the Congressman.
Hey, how y'all doing?
Good.
Fine, sir.
I listen to your program all the time and try and get through all the time, like I was telling the lady.
Glad to have you.
My question is, the first ones, Mr. Jordan and the Republicans, the first ones President Bush bailed out was the ones that caused it, and that is the financial Wall Street, the little tricks that they pulled, got rid of all the rules by the government for us, the people who are the government, to control these people. And we've been told and told and told, oh, we'll regulate ourselves, everything will be all right. Well, every one of them did not regulate themselves. Merrill Lynch, all the big ones. And the first thing these Republicans did was bail them out. Now you're criticizing Obama for, which I don't agree with neither, but bailing out the people that do the work. And I think it's just,
well,
and you always come with this.
Yeah, I don't think I mentioned President Obama's name yet in relation to the financial bailout. I was against the bailout when Mr. Bush did it, when President Bush did it. In fact, one of the questions I'll ask Mr. Paulson today is, if you remember in the weeks leading up to the October 3rd vote that the Congress took, where we actually approved $700 billion of taxpayer money going for the TARP program, which, as I said, I voted against. I thought it was a crazy idea. The whole premise of that debate was that the Treasury Secretary was going to take that $700 billion of taxpayer money and buy the troubled assets, the toxic assets. They've yet to buy any of those. And so I want to ask Mr. Paulson, based on the deception we've seen play out in the Merrill Lynch Bank of America acquisition, I want to ask him, when in fact did he change strategy? Because on October 3rd, the majority of Congress who voted for that plan assumed that he was going to do what he told Congress he was going to do, which is go purchase the troubled assets. But less than 10 days, or actually 10 days later, when the big banks were brought to Washington, he said, we're just going to inject capital. We're just going to give you cash. sign the form and take the money whether you like it or not. So that's a question I think that's appropriate to ask Mr. Paulson today. When did the strategy change? And in fact, did it change before Congress took the vote, which would, frankly, square with the pattern we've seen and show that they were deceiving Congress as well?
Mr. Jordan is in his second term representing Ohio's 4th District. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Wisconsin, master's in education from Ohio State, and has a law degree from Capital University. He's also serving in the House on the Judiciary Committee and the Budget Committee. Let's take our next telephone call for him as we discuss the committee's investigation into the TARP program. Frederick, Maryland. Eric is on the line. Go ahead, Eric.
Yes, sir. I have a question about the original TARP legislation. As you know, the Constitution requires revenue bills, which are both tax and spending bills, to originate in the House. And the Senate deceitfully put the bill that they sent you in the Paul Wellstone Mental Health and Addiction Recovery Act, which completely violates the Germaneness Act. Therefore, the bill never originated in the House. And I wanted to know if you think the Speaker of the House should be impeached for failing to fulfill her Constitution duty to blue-slip that legislation and send it back to the Senate.
Well, as I indicated, and I appreciate your call, I voted against the legislation for a number of reasons. You've added an additional one. What I've typically seen is what the leadership wants to get passed, they get passed, and they find a way to make things, make amendments and make bills or amendments being added to legislation. They find a way to make those germane. Unfortunately, this one was made in order and did pass. I think it was, as I've said before, the wrong direction to head. Once you start down this bailout trail, it is tough to turn around, and we have seen that. For a variety of reasons. Once you start down this, it's tough to change. It's tough to turn back. That's why we never should have started down the road in the first place.
What do you think will come out of these hearings?
Well, you know, I'm hopeful that we'll kind of get the testimony squared, because there were some discrepancies between what Mr. Lewis has said, frankly what Mr. Bernanke said, the clip you played. So hopefully we can square that up. But I'm also hopeful that we can project to the American people why this is a bad precedent, why it is wrong to have this kind of federal government involvement in the private sector. And I think more and more Americans are waking up to this. You've seen this phenomenon of the Tea Parties around the country. We've seen what's happened with the auto bailouts and how I know personally in our district where we've had a facility closed. People are I think upset by the unprecedented nature of federal involvement, and what I would say are, you know, a political economy where government's picking the winners and losers, who gets bailed out, who doesn't. We have headlines today where CIT is not going to get any additional help, so they're going to be allowed to fail, and yet as we know, Goldman Sachs was helped and had a record quarter this year. So that's troublesome, I think, to many Americans, and I think more and more Americans are waking up to that fact.
Now, there's another headline I wanted to have you help us understand on the front page of the Financial Times this morning. Not CIT, but Citibank, close to a secret deal with regulator.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Let me read you a little bit of it and see if you can help us understand it. Let me get my glasses here. Citigroup is close to a secret agreement with one of its main regulators that will increase scrutiny of the U.S. bank and force it to fix financial management and governance issues. People close to the situation said the deal had been discussed in recent weeks amid increased pressure on Citi from the FDIC, the regulator, and could be finalized soon. The proposed agreement requires, among other things, that Citi strengthens its board and governance, improves asset quality, better manages expenses, and provides more information to regulators on its capital and liquidity, these people added. The regulator's action highlights concerns over Citi's financial health, governance, and the strength of its management team, led by Vikram Pandit, chief executive. The FDIC is known to be frustrated with the slow pace of Citi's toxic asset sales, its losses, and the lack of a commercial banking experience at the top.
Yeah, I mean, look, one of the terms used in there was pressure. If the pressure is consistent with then it's appropriate. If it's the kind of pressure we saw displayed in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch deal, where you have threats, where you have intimidation, where you have both the Fed chairman and the Treasury Secretary instruct the timing of disclosure is important. We don't want disclosable events given at a certain. If you have that kind of pressure, then it's not appropriate. So I'd have to delve into it deeper. But that's my concern, is that when it crosses the line and you have this, as I've said before, this unprecedented type of pressure and intimidation placed on the private sector. I think that's a concern.
The article reminds us that Citi is about to cede a 34% stake in its equity to the U.S. government as part of its earlier agreement for government bailout money. Let's take our next telephone call for Congressman Jordan. It is from Metairie, Louisiana. This is Woody, Independent Line. You're on the air.
Yes, hello.
Good morning.
Yes. Thank you very much for grilling this guy, but I'd like to see him arrested. Being the fact that he is openly admitted to testifying, because a lot of, or intimidation, being the fact that we have a lot of people in government right now that have openly admitted to committing crimes, but there's no accountability. I mean, it's one thing, I was wrong. Gee, I intimidated this guy. Gee, I'm sorry. Yeah, we tortured, but it was for a good reason. All on about all the crimes that has been committed by now, but no one in the, looking ahead instead of taking care of the accountability of the crimes. The Federal Reserve isn't even legal.
Thank you, Woody. Let's get a response.
Well, one thing I would say about the Federal Reserve, we're working on legislation bipartisan with the chairman of the House Government Reform Committee, Mr. Towns, Mr. Issa, the ranking member, Mr. Kucinich, chairman of the subcommittee, and myself as ranking member of that subcommittee, working on legislation that says we do need greater scrutiny and oversight of the Fed, particularly in those areas where they have now moved outside their central mission. We think that is appropriate. So I think the caller's right there. The other thing I point out is this. When you put legislation together as quickly as it was done last fall, remember what started this whole thing was last fall, in the midst of this financial concern and financial crisis out there, was the $700 billion bailout, the first big bailout, the TARP program. When you put legislation together that quickly, you are bound to make mistakes. And there was a lack of, I think, real oversight when we put that together. It led to the whole fiasco at AIG with the bonuses. So that's a problem when you throw it together and you give this kind of power to government and this kind of intervention that they're allowed to have in the private sector. That is scary, and that's why you got to be careful when you throw things together. Oh, the world's going to end the crisis. Mr. Paulson in this whole Bank of America issue has talked about if in fact the merger didn't take or the acquisition didn't take place, the sky was going to fall, the world was going to, this doomsday scenario. Well, we have emails from other people involved in the Federal Reserve who say, look, he was being a little over the top in those predictions. But it's always this crisis mentality that grabs a hold of the people who want the taxpayer money and who want more power and more control over what happens in America and in our business lives and our families' lives.
C-SPAN 2 right now is re-airing Ken Lewis's testimony if you're interested in refresh before the hearing starts live today. Just following on that question, perhaps you just answered it, but a viewer twittered this question. Do you think that the September-October capital injection was necessary? In other words, was there a crisis that put the global system at risk?
I mean, the argument you will get from those who favor it, I voted against it. I thought it was the wrong thing to do. As I've said before, to see this kind of action taken by the government where they step in the private sector and start to determine who wins, which banks get help, which financial institutions don't, and starts picking the winners and losers is a scary road to travel down, as I've indicated. So I voted against it. I think there were better ways to address the situation, things that we could have done that would have helped our economy, things that we could have done that would have helped our financial institutions. And so I think it was the wrong approach to take. And frankly, all you got to do is look at even more recent history. We heard back in February that we had to pass this stimulus package. Part of this whole what I call bailout fever that's got a hold of this town. We had to pass this stimulus package because if we didn't, unemployment would rise above 8%. And so the stimulus package was passed. I voted against it too. I thought it was the wrong approach. But it was passed. And what we find now is unemployment is close to 10% across the country. So you have that example of where, this crisis mentality, we got to do something. We got to go spend a boatload of taxpayer money to, quote, solve the problem, and yet the problem gets worse. And so I would argue the same thing applies to the bailout that took place last fall.
International Falls, Minnesota, you're on the air for the Congressman.
Yeah, this is Paul from International Falls. Yeah, I'm a Democrat, a bleeding heart Democrat, and I'm proud of it. And the thing of it is, you folks get in there, you don't listen to the American people. 76% of us want a single payer health care, and you won't give it.
Really?
You don't even want competition.
76% want the government to run health care?
Yes, 76% does.
76%. You have to send me that information and show me where that comes from.
Well,
but
if you listen to your polls, you might understand where it came from.
I would disagree
you people
tremendously.
Don't listen, and you worry about how the Democrats treat you now. And you treated the Democrats disgracefully for 6 years of the last 8. In fact, for the last 10 years before.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. We're almost out of time. Congressman?
Well, I would say my whole time here on the show, Susan, I've mostly been criticizing Hank Paulson, who was George Bush's Treasury Secretary. So I'm as critical of Republicans as I am Democrats if they're doing things that I think don't square with the Constitution and don't square with a philosophy that says we should empower people and empower families and empower the private sector versus having this top-down model where government's got this unbelievable ability to intervene in the free enterprise system. You know, the caller, on the health care issue that the caller raised, I think the vast majority of Americans would much rather have their health care decisions made by themselves, their families, and their doctor versus some federal board with the equivalent power of the auto task force deciding what kind of health care treatment they're going to get. I just fundamentally disagree with the caller's premise on the idea that Americans want the federal government running their health care.
In the public media and on the internet, lots of concern about the lack of transparency about how the TARP funds have been sent. Do you, as a member of this committee, have any better information on the question?
In fact, one of the things I'll bring up with Mr. Paulson today is we created the Oversight Board when TARP was passed. And based on what was going on, there were 3 meetings of that Oversight Board during the Merrill Bank of America acquisition, and Mr. Paulson waited till the 3rd meeting after the fact to inform that board what was going on with Bank of America and Merrill Lynch. So I don't think we're getting the kind of oversight, the kind of transparency we need, particularly when you think about the fact that it's $700 billion of taxpayer money. The one issue we haven't raised here, too, is all this spending, all this stimulus, all this bailout, this road we've traveled down, is what it really means for future generations of Americans. This past week, we hit a $1 trillion deficit level. First time in American history we've had that kind of deficit. We still have 4 months left in the fiscal year, and we're already at $1 trillion deficit. Unprecedented what we're doing to our kids and our grandkids, because it has to be paid back. One of the things you learn is, you mentioned I majored in economics. One of the things you learn in economics is there's no free lunch. The money has to be paid back. And when a country begins to saddle future generations with that kind of debt, you're moving in the wrong direction. We need to get a handle on this spending, and it starts with these kind of things that we shouldn't have done in the first place.
Mr. Jordan, thank you for being here this morning. Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio, member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. They will be hearing today from former Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, and our cameras will be there so you have a chance to see that testimony. Well, on this Thursday morning, it's day 3 for